On this episode of the Challenge All-Stars, the rematch fans have waited over a decade to watch, a second pole wrestle between Derek and Wes, finally comes to fruition. Almost.
Let's go, Nehemiah.
Woo! All right, Nehemiah, Derek, come on down.
I'm Lizzie Frizzle, and this is the Recap Corner. Today, we're talking about Season 3, Episode 8, called Going Bananas. It wasn't until I saw this episode's title that I remembered, with a shudder and an audible ugh, that when the full trailer was released back at the beginning of the season, it teased that Johnny Bananas would appear at some point in some capacity. And now that he finally did toward the end of this episode, no one is as surprised as I am to say that it wasn't that bad. But before we talk about produce people, let's talk about what happens in the first half of the episode. After not hearing too much about the mysterious stars all season, other than TJ's occasional reminders that they exist, they're suddenly all anyone cares about, except Nehemiah.
I don't care enough about the stars to volunteer.
Obviously, the cast and/or the editors are more concerned with stars now because we're one episode away from the final. But their abrupt emergence as something that's significantly affecting people's decisions was still jarring. Again, Nehemiah excluded.
I don't care enough about the stars to volunteer.
In the past, when contestants have been excited to win someone else's stars, like Janae after she beat Beth or Derek after beating MJ, there were other factors that led to them competing in elimination against each other. As far as we know, people have yet to be targeted primarily for their stars. Until now. Now, Wes aggressively targets Derek in pursuit of his 4 stars. The reality is that Wes probably would have targeted Derek anyway, given Wes's relationships with his remaining castmates, but this way, the edit reminds the audience that the stars exist just in time for them to finally matter. Almost as if the editors planned it that way. Another major storyline that's introduced early is less game-based, more interpersonal. Nia needs a why. With Jordan freshly eliminated, Nia feels unmotivated to compete and is unsure of her purpose on the season moving forward. It seems like a crisis of self-confidence to me, and as someone who experiences that every morning when I open my eyes and remember who I am, I related. And I felt pretty badly for Nia throughout basically the whole episode. Fortunately, Nehemiah is there to encourage Nia, and in an interview, he says that he hopes in time Nia can learn to be her own why, which is exactly the kind of phrase that would have been on a poster for sale in the back of an AC Moore. As the cast prepares for the last challenge before the final, I'm expecting something cold or cold water based because we see Kayla putting on a jacket, but that turns out to be totally meaningless and she's not even wearing the jacket when the cast shows up to the challenge site. Upon their arrival, TJ reveals that due to her fall down the stairs last episode, Veronica has broken a toe and is disqualified from the remainder of the season. I think last episode pretty heavily foreshadowed that this was going to happen, but it didn't make watching it any less disappointing. Now, 4 women, Melinda, Tina, Jemmye, and Veronica have all been removed from the season without being properly eliminated, and Beth, who joined halfway as a replacement, quit everything, then left an episode later. I know this is how TJ usually announces medical DQs, but watching Veronica leave was made even sadder by the fact that she was fully dressed to compete. It's like when you show up to work at 9 a.m. and then you get fired at 9:05. Veronica's departure also leaves Derek and Kayla as the last remaining Treehouse members. Even though Derek's barely been depicted as part of Treehouse since he was introduced as a member. Instead, he's been caught up with Mark, Brad, and the Men's Alliance. Veronica's DQ also leaves unanswered questions about potential tension between her and Kellyanne as advertised in either the full season or the mid-season trailer. I remember Kellyanne calling Veronica like a spider or a wolf, maybe a wolf spider. After Veronica leaves, the challenge called Flight Pattern gets underway. A colorful pattern floats on a platform in the middle of a lagoon. It can only be seen via a bird's eye view. Cue the helicopter entrance. Competing 2 at a time, how that order or those pairs are determined, we don't know. Players lean out the sides of the helicopter to memorize the color pattern, using a red line on the platform for orientation so they know which side is the top. After seeing the pattern, the helicopter transports players to a designated drop zone. From there, players release their own ripcord, dropping from the helicopter into the water. Then they swim to their puzzle station and recreate the pattern to the best of their memory, calling for their time to be stopped when they're done. The 2 fastest players to correctly recreate the pattern from any heat form the authority. The female winner also earns Veronica's star, which I think is a great idea. I wondered why Tina and Jemmye's stars weren't also redistributed this way, but I figured maybe it was because both Tina and Jemmye left in between a challenge and an elimination, as opposed to Veronica, who left at the start of a challenge. Kellyanne and Mark compete in the first heat, but to be honest, I don't really remember anything that happens in it because I was hypnotized by Kellyanne's perfectly waterproof mascara. The second heat features Kayla and Derek. The only thing to note is that Kayla's bad at memorizing. Heat 3 is Jonna and Wes. Again, pretty uneventful. Wes gives a fun interview about wanting to win the season not for the money, but for the trophy, which is a very Wes stance to take. And after a poorly timed jump into the drop zone, Jonna has to swim a long time to get to her puzzle station. We don't get to see actually how much time it takes, but from the way the cast talks about it, I'm thinking days. Heat 4 is Nia and Brad, and it's definitely the most eventful. Before the helicopter even takes off, Nia is scared to compete. Brad encourages her and us via a great interview.
You have to do your best. You have to leave it all on the field.
Let's go before I change my mind.
But unfortunately, once the helicopter is in the air, Nia's fear becomes overwhelming and she quits the challenge. Just this challenge, though, not like the whole challenge. Heat 5 is just Nehemiah since we lost Veronica before the challenge started. Via interview, Nehemiah tells us that all season he's been purposefully avoiding the authority, or throwing challenges, so as to not make himself a target. Very Dr. Will of him, if true. After everyone's competed, TJ reveals that only 2 men, Mark and Derek, successfully recreated the pattern. And of those 2, Mark did it faster, making him the winner. As for the women, again, only 2 successfully recreated the pattern, Kellyanne and Jonna. Unfortunately for Kellyanne, she forgot to use the red line for orientation and recreated her puzzle 90 degrees off from the way it was supposed to be recreated. That leaves Jonna as the women's winner, earning her 5th star. After the challenge, it's all game talk all the time, which I love. Let's start with the women's half. All 3 women who were at risk, Kellyanne, Nia, and Kayla, volunteer for the arena. It starts with Nia. She's the first to volunteer for elimination, basically to atone for quitting the challenge. It's Nia's volunteering that panics Kellyanne into volunteering herself. Then in turn, Kayla volunteers, seemingly just to prove that she's not scared of volunteering. Not only was this a fun, fast-paced segment, but it also showcased Jonna's superior social game. She knows exactly what demeanor to put on when she's dealing with Nia, Kellyanne, or Kayla. When she's talking to Nia, Jonna is nurturing and comforting. When she's talking to Kellyanne, Jonna is quiet and agreeable. And when she's talking to Kayla, Jonna just shits on Kellyanne. The strategy on the men's half is even more chaotic, but one thing is clear. No matter what, Brad is safe. Mark is not going to vote him into the arena via the authority, and of the other men at risk, Derek, Wes, and Nehemiah, none of them are going after Brad either. And he's only got 1 star. That leaves Derek, Wes, and Nehemiah. Wes volunteers to be the authority's vote, hoping that he can compete in the arena against Derek, win, and steal Derek's 4 stars right before the final. That would give Wes 6 stars. Conversely, there's Nehemiah, who we already know doesn't care about stars. Even though we're so close to the season finale, it's still impossible to tell whose star approach, Wes or Nehemiah's, will prove to be the right one. Wes is hyper-focused on earning more stars. Nehemiah couldn't care at all. And I think their total opposite opinions speak to the challenge's inconsistency when it comes to advantages. Sometimes the producers come up with advantages that are way overpowered, and other times they come up with advantages that are basically rendered useless by things like time equalizers. It's impossible to know which way the stars will go until we find out what they're for. Regardless, it's clear that if Mark uses the authority to vote either Wes or Nehemiah into the arena, then either one will choose Derek to be their opponent. If Mark uses the authority to vote Derek into the arena, then Derek has the opportunity to see the arena game and choose his own opponent, Wes or Nehemiah, based on what he sees. Sounds like a pretty complicated situation, right? One with a lot of moving parts, the kind you might need a little advice about. Perhaps from an intellectual mercenary. Wes FaceTimes, or Zooms, video calls, Johnny Bananas in search of strategic advice. How does Bananas respond? By putting on a thong and mooning Wes twice. At the authority deliberation, Jonna pitches voting Wes in to make him eat his words. But based on the previous scenes, it's pretty obvious that Mark is going to advocate for Derek to be their vote. 2 seconds later, the results are in. The authority votes Kayla in for the women. As a reward for performing well all season, Jonna says this is Kayla's opportunity to earn more stars. As for the men, the authority votes in Derek as expected. As the cast arrives at the arena, everyone immediately notices a lone pole in the middle of the sand and assumes a pole wrestle is imminent. Again, let's talk about the women first. Nia delivers one of my favorite interviews of maybe the entire season when she explains why it would be a bad idea for Kayla to choose to compete against her.
For Kayla's sake, I hope that she would not call my name because I would dog walk her. And she knows that, so.
A few minutes later, Kayla unsurprisingly chooses to compete against Kellyanne. Now, let's talk about the men. At the top of this segment, Wes tells us that he and Derek are the ones who made pole wrestle famous. And for once, he's not doing that exaggerating, braggadocious Wes character thing. He's just telling it true. On The Duel, way back in 2006, Derek and Wes competed in a pole wrestle against each other. This was an early iteration of pole wrestle. The rules were a little different. You kind of had to stay on your knees the whole time, or at least had to have the clear intention of trying to stay on your knees. Anyway, the elimination became an instant classic. Wes won, but not easily. And since then, like Wes says in this episode, on podcasts, in other interviews, on other seasons of the show, Derek has talked adamantly about wanting a rematch and about feeling confidently that he would win that rematch. So when the cast walked into this arena, pole in sand, Derek with the power to choose to compete against Wes, I thought for sure that rematch was finally going to happen. I mean, Derek basically tells us it's going to happen.
I have played on the opposite side of Wes for a few seasons, and we've had quite the rocky relationship, and I fully intend in kicking his ass tonight.
Then, when the time comes to actually pick his opponent, Derek does this.
And I want to make it to the next step, and I want it to be easier on me. Although I'd like to fucking kick Wes's ass, I have to think about my family. And in season 1, we did the damn thing. Season 2, you did the damn thing. In season 3, we're gonna do the trilogy, and we're gonna do it in the arena. Let's go, Nehemiah.
Of course, it's understandable that Derek wants to compete against the person he thinks will be easier to beat. And I do appreciate his producership in trying to turn his rivalry with Nehemiah into some kind of like pay-per-view trilogy event. But the truth is, it just does not compare to a Derek Wes pole wrestle rematch. We learn that the elimination is not actually called pole wrestle. It's called Light My Fire. In addition to the pole in the middle of the sand, 2 cauldrons, one for each player, are on opposite sides of the arena. First, players do compete in a pole wrestle. After freeing the pole from your opponent, you run it to your cauldron, then light it on fire. Oh yeah, the cauldrons are both on fire. However, just because you've freed the pole doesn't mean that you've won. As you're making your way to your cauldron, your opponent can chase after you, tackle you, re-wrestle the pole away from you, then run it to their cauldron, and back and forth and back and forth. First person to light the pole on fire wins. The elimination is basically a pole wrestle combined with the mechanics of Balls In, dressed up as if the producers thought this episode was going to air on Halloween. The men compete first, and about 5 seconds into their heat, the episode cuts to black. It's a freaking cliffhanger! All my leftover thoughts this week are about the next time on the challenge segment. It starts with the conclusion of this episode's elimination. First, we hear Nia accuse someone of cheating, but we don't get a lot of context. We don't get any context. Then we see Kayla and Kellyanne in the arena about to begin their heat, which really surprised me. Because throughout this entire episode, I kept expecting TJ to reveal that there was no women's elimination. But this next time on the challenge segment certainly wants me to think that there's going to be. However, I think Kellyanne and Kayla are just in the starting pole wrestle position so they could put that shot in this next time on the challenge segment. And I fully believe that TJ is going to cancel the women's arena at the last moment. The main reason I think that is because later on in this next time on the challenge, we see cast members competing in the final. At one point, it appears like Jonna and Wes are running together, and at a later point, it appears like Nia and Brad are running together. So if there is a team up element to the final, then there would have to be an equal number of men and women left. Right? Or is TJ finally going to compete? Thanks for watching. Come back next Tuesday for another Challenge All-Stars recap. And in the meantime, if you're so inclined, please like and subscribe. Thanks again. Bye.
And with all due respect to y'all, if I go in and take out Derek Stars, I am gonna win. If I have the most stars, I'm gonna be chucking them at whoever's behind me.
Yeah.
The whole time, like turtle shells. I played Mario Kart my whole life. I know how to fucking put those banana peels behind me. I'm gonna fuck you guys up.